We can see us. There will be other things on the screen. Welcome everyone to Second Tuesday presentation of Glitter and Concrete, a cultural history of drag in New York City with the author Alyssa Max Goodman. Technically, this is a center event, but I do not work for the center. I run the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder along with my partner, Donnie Jokum. And the Bureau is an all-volunteer queer bookstore that is open normally Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. But tonight we are hosting Second Tuesday because it is a book-related event and we are all things both. If you're not already on our email list and you'd like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, or you can visit our website, bgsqd.com, and you'll find out about our upcoming events, of which there are many. And before I turn things over to Alyssa and read her bio, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a call for a ceasefire. The Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-Native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. We also want to recognize that today, April 9th, is the 186th day of Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people, funded by our tax dollars and enabled by our government's unwavering support. We hope that you will join us in calling for an immediate, permanent ceasefire, an end to the siege, and an end to the occupation in order to stop the collective punishment of Palestinians and to ensure the swift delivery of food, water, medicine, fuel, and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. And now, Alyssa Goodman is a New York-based writer and photographer specializing in nonfiction writing and documentary photography. Her first book, Glitter and Concrete, A Cultural History of Drag in New York City, is out now from Hanover Square Press. She is represented by Melissa Donaxo at Stuart Krzyzewski Agency. Please give Alyssa a very warm welcome.
Say what? Oh, I'm holding. Oh, I can do this at the end too. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much to the center and to the bookstore for having me. I'm going to push this out of the way a little bit so I don't trip on it. I am delighted to be here tonight, a part of the long-running and long-standing and legendary Second Tuesday series. So thank you so much for having me. So tonight I'm going to present a little bit about the book and a little bit about New York City drag history. And I think that's it. I think that's all you need to know. So we can pull up those slides, and then I can boogie down with you all.
All right.
There we go.
Right.
Beautiful. Oops.
Oh, did it go back?
Just one.
There we go.
There we go. So this presentation is called A Few Words About Drag. And I will start with the second slide, I guess.
Oh, it's being fun. There we go.
So it was 1995, and I was about 7 years old, and I saw the film To Wong Foo, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, for the first time. The film follows the journey, if you're not familiar, of three drag queens as they attempt to drive cross-country from New York to Los Angeles. To that point, my mother had raised me on movie musicals from the 1950s, and what I loved most were the costumes and being transported by the song and dance numbers. That is, of course, until I saw To Wong Foo. It didn't hurt that my mother learned how to do her makeup from a man named Frank Hill, who in Fort Lauderdale was an Anne Margaret impersonator. I felt immediately connected to the ladies from To Wong Foo. They were my Disney princesses, but they were better than that. They were glamorous and exciting, multidimensional, and fabulous. And while we now know the film has aspects to celebrate, question, and criticize, it did help acquaint a generation with drag, myself, of course, included. After seeing To Wong Foo, of course, which is the poster you see here, I consumed drag every way that I could. At 19, I went with my parents to my first drag show at Cinema Paradiso in Fort Lauderdale, starring drag magician Cashetta, who is New York based. Some of you may remember her. May she rest. I also went with my family to Lips, a drag restaurant and bar on Oakland Park Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale, which I didn't know at the time had an original in New York City. I watched the movies, Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, Paris is Burning, The Birdcage, Victor Victoria, Connie and Carla, anything that I could get my hands on. And eventually the inimitable RuPaul's Drag Race became the first way I, along with so many others, found a way to see drag on a regular basis at home. So starting with To Wong Foo, the outlook of drag, the triumph of glamour over negativity, would become the driving force of my own life as I navigated through the trials and tribulations of self-doubt, self-acceptance, and self-love. Drag is the thing, the art form that taught me to love myself. And it is for this reason I have always carried with it such great reverence and love. So we can go to the next slide, please, if you don't mind. There we go. So I'm going to read a little bit and then I will cue you if you don't mind.
Not at all.
In college, my fascination with drag evolved into a deep appreciation for the effects of drag and gender performance, perhaps most famously described by Judith Butler in their foundational text, Gender Trouble, Feminism, and the Subversion of Identity. Drag is an example that is meant to establish that reality is not as fixed as we generally assume it to be. The purpose of the example is to expose the tenuousness of gender reality in order to counter the violence performed by gender norms. Drag alters our thinking about the limits of gender. The magic is truly in the makeup. My love of drag grew. Drag performers were not just ferocious entertainers, costume designers, and makeup artists. They were gender punks and outlaws who acted, it seemed, however they wished, despite society repeatedly telling them that they were unnatural, wrong, not good enough, or obscene. Their strength of character became the new backbone for my love of drag. In November 2017, the legendary New York drag queen Flawless Sabrina, star of the 1968 documentary The Queen and drag mother to countless others, passed away. Some of you may have known her. I wanted to make sure we didn't lose her story or any others, that people knew the history of drag started long before a television show, important to our current state of drag, though it may be. I wanted to remind lovers of modern drag how the art form got to the place it currently occupies and share the role New York City played in that phenomenon. So you can press play. And this is my book trailer.
There's a certain way the light sidewalk. A streak of glitter in the daytime, a mystical shine in the darkness at night that seems to transcend time. Suddenly, when that glitter appears on the concrete, there's a jolt of memory. Every pair of heels that's twinkled across its gleaming surface, every tattered Oxford, every chunky combat boot, every life that's come before. We're taught to believe glitter, like drag, is artificial. But when light hits the concrete just the right way, and so clearly sends sparkles flying, there's nothing more real.
So that's my book, Glitter and Concrete, A Cultural History of Drag in New York City. Glitter and Concrete.
There's this.
Whoops.
Ooh, ew. Glitter and Concrete covers New York City drag history from 1865 to the present across the gender, ethnic, and performance spectrum. It features 93 interviews with 85 people done in 5.5 years of my life. In reality, I wrote a book I wanted to read and continue to make myself a student of the form as it presents itself in the city. While much of drag's presence in our culture currently, like I mentioned, has been driven by RuPaul's Drag Race, the history of drag goes so much deeper. My hope is that the book shares this. Something else I hope for now is that the book finds the people who need it, who want to know their roots or the roots of the art form they love. As I write in the book, having access to your history should be a right and not a privilege. Glitter and Concrete, A Cultural History of Drag in New York City was released on September 12th, 2023, and is now available for purchase right here in this fine bookstore, and at your local library and wherever else fine books are sold, and hopefully some places they're not. Fantastic. This is the slide I needed. Thank you. One of my favorite things I learned about the history of drag in New York City is how closely its development and evolution is tied to the history of New York and to American history as a whole. I often say drag history is New York history, is American history. The place we're at with drag in history now, though, is unfortunately one that's repeated throughout the form's history, the last 160 years, of course, included, but it is ultimately a story of triumph. At one point in the late 19th century, gender impersonation was among the most popular forms of theater. However, the Long Depression soon entered the picture, and around that time, and men impacted by financial insecurity needed a change in the kind of male drag they saw on variety stages, a precursor to American vaudeville stages. Male impersonators like Ella Wester and Annie Hindle, and over there on the left, you see Ella Wester, and Annie Hindle used to impersonate men. And after the Long Depression, the trend became for male impersonators to imitate boys, like Kitty Donner, who is pictured right below her. And Kitty Donner became a sensation. The performers who couldn't adapt found their careers waning because men were the ones with the money who bought tickets. There was another surge against drag in the 1910s and 1920s when mostly white women were granted the right to vote, entered the workplace more fully, and there was a surge in the immigrant population, all of which middle-class men felt compromised their abilities to get jobs. So now moving over a little bit, Julian Eltinge was the RuPaul of his day. He also had his own publication, the Julian Eltinge Magazine, in which he advised women about makeup and promoted his cosmetics line, which was highly regarded for its cold cream. He even had a line of cigars. In 1912, the Eltinge Theater was built in his honor at 236 West 42nd Street. The theater features a mural of 3 muses who are all allegedly Eltinge in drag. It still stands today as an AMC theater, absorbed into an adjacent building. Eltinge is interesting because his career is a shorthand for the placement and later influence of queer culture in society. In Eltinge's theatrical work, he regularly played a character that, through whatever twists and turns in the show's plot, must disguise himself as a woman. The compulsory element in Eltinge's time was essential because it made cross-dressing a point of comedy as opposed to transgression. He took this element of compulsion with him throughout his career, actively seeking to lend a higher class status to female impersonators whose performances were often otherwise confined to dive bars and looked down upon. Eltinge also sought to cultivate an especially masculine public image. Even a hint of homosexuality or abnormality, degeneracy or perversion, terms of the time, would have destroyed his career. Instead, Eltinge participated in staged boxing matches and was said, advertised possibly, to be so tough he was stabbed by a marlin and survived. You can take that to mean whatever you like. His agents knew how to manipulate the press, and rumors of his sexuality were mostly averted. But even so, you'll still see this kind of drag storyline pop up across pop culture's touchstones long after Eltinge's peak in films like Some Like It Hot, Tootsie, Mrs. Doubtfire, Big Mama's House, and countless others, Bosom Buddies with Tom Hanks. There was always an essential need, like this was the way you had to solve the problem, and that's why it was okay, kind of vibe to the whole scenario. Elton popularity was followed by the pansy craze, this vogue for queerness among straight society, and the leading pansy performer of this time was a performer named Jean Mallon, who is pictured there with the flower in his lapel. Pansy performance, I think the best way I can describe it is if you would imagine a very flamboyant gay man walking around a very elegant nightclub in a tuxedo, just sort of giving tongue lashes to everyone in the audience, and they were living for it. And sometimes there would be singing, and sometimes there would be, and often actually there was a drag artist accompanying a pansy performer. I think the best example I can give of pansy performance on screen, there is that clip that has circulated from the 1930s, but I think a better example is, and one that is executed by a gay man, is Robert Preston in Victor Victoria, where at the beginning he's sort of like saucily sauntering through the nightclub with like a little handkerchief. That is a kind of embodiment of pansy performance. So if you are interested in checking that out, I highly recommend it. The movie is exquisite, he is exquisite, and it's another way to envision pansy performance. But pansy performance is important because this was the time when, like I mentioned, there would be drag artists performing alongside these entertainers. And this was the first time, because of not just the vogue for queerness at the time, but the vogue for the taboo that was brought on by prohibition. This was the first time that mainstream straight audiences would equate drag with queerness, which is important because once the Great Depression rolls around, anything that deviates from the norm is shoved back under the rug. So this time, this was a time, the pansy craze, when queer performance and queer performers of all stripes were celebrated and then almost immediately shoved back in the closet. But this is also an important time because you get people like Gladys Bentley, who is down there. And Gladys Bentley was not a male impersonator, but she was important because she was a person who wore gender nonconforming attire in public, and was considered a great star to the point that she was called La Bentley, the way that Josephine Baker was called La Baker in her time. It was another presence of gender nonconformity in culture at the time that she helped push through. So yes, when the Great Depression arrived, anything that undermined men or went against the grain of gender norms went out, and drag went with it. In New York, Mayor LaGuardia banned drag between 14th Street and 72nd Street completely in hopes of cleaning up the city in time for the 1939 World's Fair. As George Chauncey writes in his stunning text, Gay New York, Times Square on 42nd Street was the showplace to the world. So banning drag there reflected that it would also in many ways be banned from mainstream culture. And this happened despite drag's insane popularity during World War II. And it was so popular because it was seen as a morale booster for soldiers during the war. It was, as an example, it featured heavily in the smash Broadway musical, This Is the Army, which of course was written by Irving Berlin. And it was a fundraiser for the Army Emergency Relief Fund that was put on by the military itself. And soldiers performed in drag throughout the show, some in, high comedic drag, and others in, full female illusion. And you can see some of this in the film version of the show, which was also directed by Michael Curtiz, who directed Casablanca, casual. And you can see both kinds of drag on view in the film. But in the program from the show, there's a certain butching of language, if you will. You know, this is a great tradition that harkens back to times of the Romans and the Greeks, you know, and then there's pictures. And then there's pictures in the program of the Secretary of War and of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and all of these high-ranking male officials, you know, casting their support for the way that this show is put together, which featured drag throughout almost the entire show. And another way this presented itself was that during the war, there was an Algiers-based performance troupe that featured drag. And they received a warm letter from Dwight D. Eisenhower, then the Allied Forces commanding general, praising the troupe for their commitment to morale boosting and to the war effort. But at the end of World War II, drag was still persona non grata, a similar reflection on the more reactionary attitude toward gender roles at the time, especially as many women entered the workforce while their husbands were away. The end of the war led many toward a conservative ache for normalcy, if you will, of which homosexuality and drag were not considered a part. And which brings us to the 1950s, where homosexuality was considered as much of a threat to the American way of life as communism. Praise be. This coincides with an event called the Lavender Scare, in which people who were suspected of being queer were fired en masse from the government. Drag, like famous traveling drag troupe, the Jewel Box Review, and actually up there you have, that's a vision of 3 soldiers in drag performing during World War II at the time. So you have troops like the Jewel Box Review, which was a troupe that started in 1939 and traveled throughout the country. And they had to present themselves as palatable to straight audiences in order to survive. There could be no whiff of impropriety or queerness, and much of the advertising was rooted in glamour and illusion. And in some of the language they used, they referred to Julian Elton. They also harkened back to the age of Shakespeare, you know, when there weren't women to be on stage. This is a grand theatrical tradition, things like that. And indeed, because of this, for a long time, drag looked one way. As the line in the producers goes, gorgeous showgirls and gooey gowns. Gorgeous makeup, presentation of elite stature, and it had to look this way to keep straight audiences happy. But after Stonewall, significantly fewer people were interested in being palatable, especially not as we moved into the AIDS crisis and the neglect of the government. Drag became, as it always was, but maybe in different forms, actively rebellious, lacking desire to be contained. And even then, as during the Stonewall Uprising and afterward, it was still not even well respected in the queer community. I had performers tell me that as late as 1993, you'd get tossed out on your ear in New York for suggesting something like a drag bingo or a drag brunch. It wasn't respected as a career choice or even really an activity to do of any kind. But that's really changed in and out of the queer community as it's become more celebrated. But in the 90s, it was very much, excuse me, sorry. In the 90s, it was very much a trend until, frankly, RuPaul brought it back with the arrival of RuPaul's Drag Race in 2009 and helped make it the force it is now. And I think what's interesting about what happens now with drag is that there have been the people who have started drag since the show has come out are either embracing the form or reacting against it, which is also reflective of some of the drag that came before them. Next slide. So I am going to focus some of my comments tonight on the Village because, of course, that's where we are. And it is impossible to talk about the history of drag in New York without talking about the Village. The neighborhood became an epicenter of drag in the city because it became an epicenter of counterculture. In his phenomenal book, The Village, historian John Strausbaugh quotes the poet Edward Field. "We were a pitifully small band in exile, homosexuals, blacks, sluts, psychotics, drag queens, radicals of all varieties, artists, ne'er-do-wells." Counterculture blossomed in the Village largely because it was a cheap place to live. An influx of factories led to a decrease in property value and an increase in residential space at the beginning of the 20th century, which attracted immigrants as well as artistic types who brought with them a liberal, nonconformist spirit that created room for queer culture. Indeed, the Village, previously known as the 9th Ward and the 15th Ward, became a locus of free-thinking life in New York and had been since the mid-19th century. It thereby became a downtown hotbed of artistic bohemian political life and, of course, queer life. And after Prohibition and Mayor LaGuardia's ban on drag between 14th Street and 72nd Street, it also became a spot for mob activity. Indeed, the mob owned most of, if not all, the gay bars and drag venues in the village between the 1920s and the 1960s, including but not limited to Club 82, the Bonsoir, Ernie's Restaurant, Three Ring Circus, the Moroccan Village, and of course, the Stonewall Inn. In the 1950s, a venue opened on Cornelia Street called the Cafe Chino, which I have a picture. There it is, up there. Yes, fantastic. Called the Cafe Chino, which led to the development of off-Broadway theater and on many occasions blended drag into queer storytelling on stage. There is still a plaque in its place marking its existence today. And after the 1966 Sip-In at Julius, initiated by Mattachine Stick Leach, Randy Wicker, John Timmons, and Craig Rodwell to reverse discriminatory disorderly conduct laws leveled against queer people in bars, a ruling passed stating, quote, the state liquor authority needed substantial evidence of indecent behavior to close a bar and not just same-sex kissing or touching. This ruling made it easier to own a bar of any kind, especially a gay bar. The mob and its exploitive practices in gay bar ownership would soon be on their way out. The Stonewall Uprising solidified this when in June 1969, patrons at the Stonewall Inn fought back against police brutality and mob exploitation. The role of drag in the village after Stonewall is also telling about the relationship between drag and queer history. After Stonewall, gay liberation invited a gay sexual revolution of sorts. What had been underground sex scenes of the 1960s emerged unapologetically in the 1970s. At the same time, some gay men embraced a hyper-masculinized aesthetic like a living Tom of Finland drawing. Drag directly countered this depiction of masculinity, and many men who took on what was called a clone aesthetic wanted nothing to do with drag. But drag artists like Ruby Rims, pictured here, eventually won them over. Lee's Mardi Gras was another village staple in what's now called the meat, or what's still called the Meatpacking District, but looked a lot different. Was a store run by queer activist Lee Brewster, whose work as an activist eventually led to drag being allowed in public. The store carried drag accoutrement, and though often meant for cross-dressing, you could find size 13 heels or false eyelashes there in a pinch, even though it was also fairly expensive. In the following decades, drag parties were the places to be, particularly those like Jackie 60. Did anyone go to Jackie 60? Yeah. Awesome. Held in the depths of the Meatpacking District when there were still severed beef limbs leading into the street.
Good time.
In creative director Rob Roth's magnificent audio history, Night Paving, an oral history of Jackie and Mother, journalist Michael Musto refers to the club night as, quote, a combination of Studio 54 and Lincoln Center for people who'd never even think of going above 14th Street. Another beloved party was Squeezebox, a rock and roll drag party. Did anyone go to Squeezebox? Yeah, amazing. A rock and roll drag party at Don Hills on Greenwich Street, one specifically for punk queers and the people who love them, where both Justin Vivian Bond and Hedwig and the Angry Inch first developed their followings. The picture from Squeezebox is at the top with Mistress Formica and Sherry Vine. And another beloved venue was Two Potato in Greenwich Village at 143 Christopher Street and Greenwich Avenue, a bar beloved by queens and queers of color. And let's also not forget Bardo at the bottom. One of the only venues at which you could see drag artists singing live, aside, of course, from Squeezebox. And then Florent, which was a beloved diner by denizens of the evening, which it sounds like we also had some people here visit. And the list goes on and on and on forever. We can do the next slide. What's exciting to me about drag now are the ways that people continue to experiment with the form. I really love Untitled Queen's work. She is the person who is pictured at the top middle here. And she has a masterful way of thinking about drag's possibilities. Excuse me. I've seen her do drag to everything from Carrie Fisher and Dave Grohl monologues to Radiohead and Green Day. Sweaty Eddie is a drag king I am excited about. This is a picture on the bottom of the Cake Boys drag king troupe has an annual show called Takes the Cake, which is a sort of like it's not a bracket. It's a weekly show that gets narrowed down. And so it's a several weeks long show. And Sweaty Eddie is one of the Cake Boys. And I am very excited about his work. He is also an Emmy-winning animator and incorporates that into his drag through stop motion animation and puppetry. And I'm really happy to see that there's a wealth of drag experiences popping up where people from a variety of backgrounds are inspired to highlight performers within drag itself, like drag kings, non-binary performers, transgender performers, Asian performers, performers of color, and much more. The same goes for ballroom. There are now events held often enough, and they were a little more spread out in the past, where people can come out consistently and approach them to learn more. I think also of Felix Rodriguez's Know Your History Ball, which aims to teach young people about ballroom icons of the past. And it makes the landscape really multifaceted. And perhaps the thing I'm most excited about is how much information there is available about drag now. The Digital Transgender Archive is a phenomenal resource for learning about gender nonconformity of all kinds, past and present. And I was also so grateful for its existence in the process of working on my book. I am also excited about all of the other work that's coming out about drag now, like films like P.S. Burns' Letter Please, which was fantastic, by Michael Seligman and Jen Texera, and unravels the lives of drag performers in New York in the 1960s. Charles Bush's new memoir, Leading Lady, the book Legends of Drag, which I think you have here.
Yes.
Yes, you have probably all of these. By Harry James Hansen and Devin Anthias, which features interviews and photographs of drag performers over 60. And Sasha Velour's new book, The Big Reveal, as well as drag and queer history Instagram accounts like Queer Happened Here and the Christopher Street Reader. I am excited that there's an appetite for the work. And that means there will only be more. And as there's more, the art form will continue to get the credit that it deserves, or at least that's my hope that it does. I'm excited to see people rallying around drag and standing up for it as an art form, which historically is not something done by straight or queer communities. Next slide. So where does drag stand today? When I started working on this book in March of 2018, I didn't expect it to be as relevant as it was today, which is definitely naive considering I wrote a book about 160 years of drag, and in about 10 to 15 year cycles, there is a backlash of some kind. But I really, for whatever reason, I thought we were through the woods, and I didn't think that the country would be in the state that it is now as it relates to drag. Drag has faced oppressive forces in, like I said, almost every decade of the last century plus, but it's brought on often when men in power or men impacted by economic crises or both feel threatened. Forces at work now are seeking to repress drag the same way that they have for the last 160 years. The vague language of the laws or proposed laws is the same pretty much as when bars could be closed for disorderly conduct. The laws repressing drag are ignorant and uninformed and frankly ridiculous, not to mention repressive to the free speech we are entitled to as citizens of this country. But that doesn't mean it will last forever or that drag will buckle under its pressure. My favorite examples of this not being true, you can see up here. One is this drag performer here on the bottom, which is the drag artist Meatball in drag as George Santos. And one of Sasha Velour's nightgown shows. And the larger picture on the left is of a performer named Julie J, who is a Brooklyn-based drag artist and was recently named Entertainer of the Year at the Glam Awards. She has brought the drag community together across boroughs in really amazing ways, specifically through her stand-up NYC shows, which have each raised tens of thousands of dollars for queens and queers across the country. Indeed, she started Stand Up NYC to raise money for drag performers and transgender individuals affected by the proposed bill banning drag in Tennessee in 2023. And though the bill was deemed unconstitutional in June of that year, when a federal judge decided the ban violated free speech protections. It remains another example of drag's role in activism and its artists' power to make change. And indeed, there was a resolution to pass a drag laureate program filed by the city council on December 31st, 2023. So we will see what happens this year. If you're not familiar with the drag laureate program, there's currently one in San Francisco and LA where there's an appointed drag artist who is an ambassador around the city. And they get paid for their time, and they are sort of like the drag mayor. And another heartening moment is also in the changes of how drag is covered in the press, where local artists like Lady Bedbug, pictured here, are given the credit they deserve and written about in language that is respectful, which is especially, I don't want to say especially, but in publications of all stripes, including the Times, this is not historically the case. Next slide, please. So drag will continue to drag. It always has. And as Justin Vivian Bond says, glamour is resistance. And I would argue that it's the other way around as well. Thank you. And actually there's one more slide, but it's a list of resources. So you can see a list of everything that I mentioned in the slideshow tonight, and feel free to check it out on your own. So we can leave that up there. And I will do a time. How much time?
Me. Perfect.
Oh, so I guess questions. It's time for Q&A.
Yeah.
Oh, that's my face. So now we have some time for questions. Yes, I'm gonna sit down because I was wearing heels.
I'm very impressed
Oh, thank you.
that someone your age has so thoroughly, I have lived every single thing up there. I've lived, I knew, it's part of my entire history in New York. There wasn't one thing you left out, including the person who won the Glamour Awards this year. How is it that you were able to research this book to the degree that you did? Because there have been a lot of books written on drag. I've never seen anything so thorough as this. As a matter of fact, if they were going to teach this course at NYU, they should have you teaching it. And your book should be mandatory.
Oh my goodness, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I think the best way to answer your question is because this is such a lifelong passion of mine. It was not a place I was afraid to live for 5.5 years. And to immerse myself in it, because then I talked about this at the beginning a little bit too. You know, I had throughout my life until the moment I started working on the book. I had to that point made myself a student of the form, and now I just did it in a more public way. Ooh, scary. No, but it was an act of love. I don't know a better way to describe it. And kind of as soon as I realized that the book didn't exist, I knew that it was important that it did. And the way I have described the feeling in the past is almost like it was like brushing my teeth. Like I just knew it had to get done, and it didn't. I don't know. I don't know. I got to a point where I felt like I had the skills to do it around the time I realized that it was a book that was important, that it existed, if that makes sense. And so I kind of, I played with the idea for a long time, and I remember the first time I said anything about it out loud was to my friend Andrew, and we had gone to see the Christmas lights in, Diker Heights. And I said, Andrew, I have this idea for a book. And I sort of sat on it for a little more. And then I had a meeting with a colleague who works in queer media in March of 2018. And I told this person about my idea for the book, and they said, do it. And I started working on it that night, actually, because I really respected the person's point of view. And I said, okay, it's time. And I can write 1,000 words a day, and so at the beginning I was collecting interviews and making lists, and And it was like I don't know, just K-holes upon K-holes upon K-holes, if that makes sense, you know, like.
Go into it.
Yeah, you know, and I mean, originally the book was 500 pages, you know, and with back matter, it would have been 600. And so now it's 364, and with back matter, it's 464. So I don't know, I wanted to make sure the stories got told. I don't know a better way to describe it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
How much did payola and payoff sort of worked with the laws?
Oh, always, almost constantly. Yeah,
Because
yeah.
laws set the payoff.
very much. I don't have the dollar amount, but it was
Yeah.
significant. I
Yeah.
mean, it was, so another interesting facet of that was that to perform in a nightclub in New York, you had to have a cabaret card. But you couldn't get a cabaret card if you had been convicted of a crime of any kind,
Mhm.
or if you were openly queer. So,
How did they improve that?
So what happened is that on a designated day, the boys at the clubs who ran the clubs would take the performers down to a particular police station to get their cabaret cards in sort of like a very organized, if you will, kind of way, so that everyone could perform legally. Yeah. So it was in almost every aspect of the queer nightlife in New York. Yeah, and I'm sure other places as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Other questions? Yes.
Recently, you were seeing a drag race, women that participated.
Sure.
The women that participated in drag.
Mhm.
You talked about how drag has changed. Have they ever performed drag?
Have I ever performed in drag? Some might say I'm in drag right now. I mean, I have, you know, it's funny, my own relationship to drag is really interesting and has only gotten more interesting as I've been working on the book. One of the first quotes that I found when I was working on the book was actually from Gloria Steinem, and she said it in this time in the 1970s, I believe, when there were a lot of feminists who really hated drag. And she said, I have no problem with drag. Women have been female impersonators for some time. So I think just the way that I think about my own gender identity is draggy, you know, like I hosted an event where called the Miss Manhattan Nonfiction Reading Series at Niagara in the East Village, but me getting dressed for that event. I mean, I'm not popping on a 301 or anything, but like I look like this, you know, when I hosted, and then there is like a little more sparkle, and you know, there's a bigger winged eyeliner than normal, shall we say, if I'm just like going out to dinner on a random evening. So there are elements of drag, I think, throughout, hopefully, oh my goodness, throughout everything I do, and any time that I am presenting myself, as it were. But I have been in drag on Halloween, mostly. Actually, this past year, my boyfriend and I both dressed up as Lester Bangs. There's a picture on my Instagram of us kissing with two mustaches on. It's really great. But mostly drag on Halloween, I would say, but not performing in drag beyond what you see here. But it does feel draggy at the very least. I had someone ask me, this was funny, there was a professor at a university who teaches queer history. And first of all, he told me, he was like, you know, I don't teach drag in my queer history class. And I was like, oh, okay. And then he said to me, well, how draggy are you? And it's just like, I'm in drag as a woman constantly.
So that's a sort of multi-dimensional answer to your question, I guess. The long answer is no, and what is it? The short answer is no, and the long answer is yes. Other questions? Yes,
I heard about that question, like, because you're not like typically the drag queen you would imagine. Or
Sure.
drag king.
sure.
Like, how is it to write about something you're not involved in? Is it
Sure.
something you would say was like something positive or negative or kind of both, or what was that?
I think because I'm not a person who kind of parachuted into drag, you know, this is a long-standing part of my life. It actually became very difficult at points for that reason, because I wanted to tell every story. And that's why the book was originally 500 pages. And from that, there were things that I had already cut, you know? And so because of the love, less than like my own identity, it became very difficult. But I wanted to do a good job. I wanted to make sure that I told the stories of people whose stories weren't told, you know, and who had made such incredible impacts, but still weren't household names in the ways that other very famous drag artists were. So I think that was what became difficult, is knowing when to stop. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Probably outside of the state of Florida.
Yeah.
Is your publisher marketing this book in Europe, in Japan, across the country, South America? Is it going?
I believe
different
distribution right
places?
now is United States and Canada. And actually, I think I mentioned I'm from Florida. And I presented the book down there too. And
You got out alive.
Oh, well, Florida is really interesting because what I usually say is that there's two parts of it. There's northern Cuba and there's southern Georgia. And I am from the part that's northern Cuba. And so it's really cosmopolitan, and there's room for lots of different kinds of identities and ideas. And especially in Miami, like I was at the Miami Book Fair and they were excited to have me. And I was at Books and Books is a very like beloved bookstore down there, and they did an event with me too.
Good.
And they said, will you come back and do a drag show with us? I said, absolutely. Which is another way I present the book, is as an event called the Glitter and Concrete Show. With drag artists interpreting passages from the book that I also read. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
So you know, there are absolutely places in Florida that are very excited about the book, which is very heartening, you know,
Yeah,
because
sure.
there's queer people everywhere. Lest what the governor have us believe. Other questions? Yes.
I'm always curious with we don't think it's trans, but apply in drag, some places you could apply, but you also get kicked out of drag.
Sure.
If you were drag full time, I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, realize it.
Well, that's a interesting one too, because a lot of that has to, the way that we understand drag and the way that we understand transgender identity, for a long time were deeply intertwined, just linguistically, right? I mean, drag queen meant a multitude of things. It meant a person who, well, let me go back. So there was a hierarchy, right? So you would say like female impersonator was a person who did drag professionally, and that person could be any gender identity, but you got paid to do it, shall we say. And then drag queen was a designation of amateurishness. It was a slur. It was slang for a transgender woman, it was slang for a transgender sex worker. Like there were different ways that we interacted with it linguistically. But it's interesting that you asked me that, because I had someone say to me, you know, like, are you doing a separate section in the book for trans women? And I said, absolutely not. Transgender women are a foundational part of this history. Like, you can't write this book without transgender women, nor would I want to. So, you know, it's the
the histories are deeply intertwined, and a lot of that has to do with the ways that we understood gender in the past and the way that we understand it now. And also, I was thinking recently about Candy Darling and like the places where different people could get jobs, at the time, and some of them could only get a job in drag, or some of them, depending in or could only get jobs in like certain kinds of spheres, shall we say. Those are identities that are deeply intertwined, and I'd never want to I don't know, to forget that, or to have anyone else forget that. Does that make sense? Yeah, of course. Other questions? How are we doing on time? We're good? Okay, well, that's all for our evening here, but I'm happy to, if you have any other questions afterward, if you think of anything, we'll be here. I'm happy to sign any books for you. But thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Alyssa.
Thank you for having me.
Good night.